My name is Tyrone. I am 62 years old, and I spent 30 hard years working as a transit dispatcher up in Chicago before retiring down here to Atlanta. I emptied my entire $67,000 retirement account, every single penny I had left, to my name just to give my only daughter the dream wedding she had always prayed for. But right before I was supposed to walk my baby girl down the aisle, the wedding coordinator pulled me into a dark supply closet. Her face was pale as a sheet. She whispered that I needed to hear something immediately. She played a security recording for me, and that tape revealed a terrifying truth. Her fiancé was not marrying her for love. He was setting my little girl up to take the fall for a massive financial trap. What I did next to protect my daughter and destroy his family will show you exactly what a father is capable of when his blood is threatened. If you are watching this, pull up a chair and listen closely. This could happen to someone you love. Let me take you back to how this nightmare started. I raised my daughter Chloe all by myself after my wife passed away. Chloe was my whole world. I worked double shifts at the transit yard. I breathed in diesel fumes and froze in the bitter Chicago winters just to make sure she had hot meals, clean clothes, and a safe roof over her head. I was a single black father trying to navigate a world that does not always give us a fair shake, but I made sure my daughter never felt the sting of our struggles. When I finally retired and we moved down to Atlanta for a slower pace of life, I thought my struggling days were over. Chloe grew up to be a brilliant, beautiful charter school administrator. I could not have been prouder of the woman she became. She had a good heart, a strong mind, and a bright future. Then she brought home Spencer Sterling. Spencer came from one of those local Atlanta families that liked to act like they owned the ground they walked on. They had money, or at least the loud, aggressive illusion of it. They drove foreign cars, they leased, wore designer suits they probably could not afford, and spoke with a kind of arrogance that immediately put my teeth on edge. From the very first dinner I had with Spencer and his parents at an upscale restaurant in Buckhead, I could feel the disrespect rolling off them in waves. They looked at my modest sedan and my calloused hands like I was the hired help. They smiled tight, polite smiles, but their eyes were cold and evaluating. Spencer's father spent the entire evening loudly bragging about his stock portfolios and his golf club memberships, while his mother made passive-aggressive comments about the neighborhood Chloe and I lived in. When Spencer proposed to Chloe, the demands started almost immediately. Spencer insisted that the wedding had to be a massive, luxurious event. He said his family had a certain image to uphold in the community. He talked about country clubs, custom floral arrangements, and imported champagne. Chloe, bless her heart, just wanted a simple, elegant ceremony at a nice botanical garden. But Spencer manipulated her. He told her that a small wedding would embarrass him in front of his business partners. He made her feel like she had to prove she was worthy of joining the prestigious Sterling family. He played on her insecurities, whispering that his parents expected a grand spectacle. I saw the worry in my daughter's eyes. She knew we did not have country club money. I saw how Spencer's mother looked at Chloe during the engagement party, like my daughter was a charity case they were graciously allowing into their pristine circle. That broke my heart. No man wants his daughter to feel less than anyone else. I told myself I would not let these arrogant people look down on my baby girl. I wanted her to walk into that marriage with her head held high, proving we did not need their handouts or their pity. So I went to the bank. I sat across from the branch manager and stared at the screen showing my life savings. $67,000. It was everything I had saved over 30 years of sweating in the train yards, missing holidays, and working overtime. I knew I needed that money for my medical bills, my property taxes, and my old age. But I pushed those logical thoughts aside. A father's job is to provide, and I was going to provide. I signed the authorization forms and liquidated my entire retirement fund. I gave Chloe the check and told her to give herself the wedding of her dreams. I told her not to worry about the cost, that her father had it covered. I thought my ultimate sacrifice would earn us a little respect from the Sterling family. I was a fool to think that. The moment the money cleared the bank, the Sterlings completely took over the wedding. They commandeered the planning process like invading generals. Spencer's mother suddenly had a list of demands that stretched a mile long. She demanded we switch the caterer from a local soul food business to a high-end French chef. She demanded custom silk linens, imported orchids that cost a fortune, and a 10-piece live orchestra instead of the DJ Chloe originally wanted. Every time a new outrageous bill came up, Spencer or his parents would conveniently look the other way. They would say things like, "Well, since the bride's family traditionally pays, we will let you handle this invoice, Tyrone." They ordered thousands of dollars in upgrades, but flat out refused to open their own wallets. They acted completely entitled to my life savings. I bit my tongue so many times I could taste the blood in my mouth. I watched them spend my sweat and tears on ice sculptures and caviar, all while treating me like an open ATM. I stayed quiet because I saw Chloe smiling. She was caught up in the whirlwind of the beautiful dresses and the fancy cake tastings. She thought Spencer's family was just being enthusiastic and welcoming. She did not see the predatory gleam in their eyes, but I felt it deep in my gut. Something was entirely wrong with these people. The friction kept building, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. 2 weeks before the wedding, Spencer's father had the nerve to ask me if I could take out a second mortgage on my house to cover an upgraded tape-shelf open bar for his wealthy golf buddies. I flatly told him no. I told him my well was completely dry. He sneered at me, adjusting his expensive tie, and muttered something under his breath about people who do not know how to host properly. I almost threw him out of my house right then and there. My fists were clenched at my sides. But Chloe walked into the room in her wedding dress, her eyes shining with absolute joy, and I swallowed my righteous anger. I told myself it would all be over soon. The checks were written, the vendors were paid. I just had to get through the ceremony, and then I could retreat to my quiet life and leave the Sterlings behind. But the universe had a very different plan for me. It was the morning of the wedding. The Georgia heat was already pressing heavily against the stained glass windows, but inside the luxury venue, the air conditioning was running full blast. I was in the bridal suite with Chloe, helping her attach a small silver locket containing a picture of her mother to her bouquet. It was a deeply emotional moment. I was holding back tears, telling her how proud her mama would be to see her looking like an absolute queen. Right at that beautiful moment, my cell phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I ignored it, not wanting to ruin the peace of the morning. But it buzzed again. And again. A relentless, angry buzzing that demanded attention. I excused myself, stepped out into the busy, carpeted hallway, and pulled the phone out. It was Mr. Miller, the general manager of the catering hall. I answered the call, expecting a quick, trivial question about the seating chart or the lighting cues. Instead, Mr. Miller was shouting. His voice echoed through the speaker, tight with panic and raw anger. He told me that if the final deposit was not settled in the next 10 minutes, he was ordering his staff to pack up all the food, tear down the tables, and lock the ballroom doors. I froze. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, chilling my skin. I told Mr. Miller there had to be a massive mistake. I personally went to the bank, requested a cashier's check for the final $15,000 deposit, and signed it 3 days ago. I handed that check directly to Spencer because he said he was driving right past the venue on his way to work and would drop it off for me. I trusted him to do one simple, basic task. Mr. Miller's voice dropped an octave, turning completely icy and uncompromising. He said the venue never received a dime of that final payment. In fact, he told me he had received an urgent notification from his bank that very morning. The $15,000 had been electronically redirected. The funds were transferred to a completely different routing number, an out-of-state corporate account that had absolutely nothing to do with the catering hall or the wedding vendors. My chest tightened painfully. The hallway around me seemed to spin, the floral arrangements blurring together. $15,000 was gone, vanished into thin air on the morning of the wedding. I asked Mr. Miller who on earth authorized a redirect of a certified venue deposit. He told me the banking system required dual authorization to redirect funds from the wedding trust account. He said the digital logs showed the transfer was initiated by Spencer Sterling and co-signed digitally by Chloe, my daughter. I knew Chloe better than I knew my own heartbeat. She would never mess with the wedding funds. She would never jeopardize her own reception on the most important day of her life. She had been stressed out of her mind for months, making sure every single detail was paid for and accounted for. Someone had to have forged her digital approval. Someone took that massive check, deposited it bypast the venue, and wired the cash out of state. And that someone was the man she was about to marry in less than 2 hours. I hung up the phone and leaned my full weight against the cold wall of the corridor. The puzzle pieces were slamming together in my brain, forming a terrifying, crystal-clear picture. Spencer and his wealthy, arrogant family refusing to pay for anything. Spencer eagerly volunteering to handle the final massive check. The money disappearing across state lines under a forged digital signature. The absolute unyielding disrespect they had shown me from day one. They were not just entitled snobs, they were thieves. I felt a physical sickness rising from the pit of my stomach. The $67,000 I bled for the money I gave up my elderly security for was being actively siphoned away right under my nose. I looked down the long hall toward the groom's dressing room. I could hear the muffled booming sounds of Spencer and his groomsmen laughing, cheering, and clinking heavy glasses behind the thick oak door. The sound of his arrogant laughter made my blood boil in my veins. It was the sound of a predator who thought he had completely outsmarted his prey. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I am a father. I am a protector. I knew if I stormed into that room right then, grabbed Spencer by the collar of his custom tuxedo, and wrapped my hands around his throat, I would end up in the back of a police cruiser. My daughter would be left weeping at the altar in absolute confusion, her special day turned into a public spectacle. I needed concrete answers. I needed to know exactly where my life savings went. And more importantly, I needed to know what else Spencer was hiding before my baby girl signed a legally binding marriage certificate and tied her entire life to a criminal. I pushed myself off the wall and started walking down the hall toward the groom's suite. My dress shoes felt heavy on the carpet, every step fueled by a rising, righteous anger. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to kick the door off its hinges and drag him out by his hair. But before my hand could even touch the polished brass doorknob, I felt a sharp, frantic tug on my sleeve. I spun around. It was Valerie, our head wedding coordinator. Her clipboard was clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. Her eyes were wide with sheer panic, darting nervously up and down the hallway to see if any of the Sterling family was watching us. She looked like she had just witnessed a murder. She grabbed my arm with surprising strength and yanked me violently away from the groom's door. She pulled me down a narrow, unlit service corridor and shoved me into a dark supply closet filled with stacked folding chairs and extra table linens. I asked her what on earth she was doing. I told her to let me go, that I needed to speak to Spencer immediately because the venue manager was threatening to throw us all out on the street over a stolen check. Valerie shook her head frantically. She held up her smartphone between us. Her hand was trembling so much she almost dropped the device onto the concrete floor. She looked me dead in the eye, her voice barely a whisper, and told me to forget the caterer for a minute. She said the $15,000 was the absolute least of my problems. She explained that earlier that morning, she had placed a small, discreet recording device in the groom's suite to capture some candid audio for the wedding videographer. It was supposed to be a nice surprise capturing the groom, talking with his brother about how much he loved the bride. But when she retreated to a quiet room to review the tape and check the audio levels, she heard something else entirely. Valerie pressed play on her phone screen. She told me to listen closely. The audio hissed and popped for a second, and then I heard Spencer's voice. It was crystal clear. And what he was saying to his brother Preston in that room shattered my entire world and ignited a fire in my soul that would not be extinguished until I burned their entire fake empire to the ground. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the hallway felt blinding as I stepped out of the supply closet. My heart was a heavy, cold stone in my chest, but my mind was firing with absolute precision. The muffled, elegant notes of a cello drifted down the corridor, mingling with the distant chatter of 200 guests waiting in the chapel. They were waiting for a celebration. They were waiting for a union. They had no idea they were sitting in the middle of a crime scene. I adjusted my posture, letting my shoulders slump slightly. I needed to be entirely convincing. I had spent 30 years observing human behavior in the crowded transit stations of Chicago. I knew what panic looked like. I knew what a medical emergency looked like. I took 3 slow, heavy steps toward the groom's suite, ensuring I was directly in the line of sight of the hired security guard and a passing waiter carrying a tray of champagne glasses. Then I let it happen. I gasped loudly, a harsh, ragged sound that echoed off the high ceilings. I brought my right hand up, clutching the fabric of my suit jacket directly over my heart. I staggered forward, allowing my knees to buckle just enough to send me crashing heavily against the oak-paneled wall. I slid down my breath, coming in short, panicked wheezes. The reaction was instantaneous. The waiter dropped his tray. Crystal glasses shattered across the polished marble floor with a deafening crash. The security guard yelled into his radio, sprinting toward me. Sir, are you all right?" The guard fell to his knees beside me, his hands hovering over my shoulders. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing a grimace of intense pain onto my face. I gripped his forearm, my fingers trembling exactly the way they had when I suffered my real minor heart attack years ago. My chest, I whispered, my voice strained and weak. "It is tight. I cannot breathe." Chaos erupted. The heavy door to the groom's suite swung open. Spencer and Preston stepped out, their arrogant smiles instantly freezing as they took in the scene. The string quartet music in the distance abruptly stopped. Footsteps pounded down the hallway. "Call an ambulance. Somebody call 911 right now." It was Valerie's voice ringing out loud and clear above the commotion. She was playing her part perfectly. Through half-closed eyelids, I watched Spencer. He looked annoyed, not concerned, not frightened for his future father-in-law, but deeply, profoundly irritated. He checked his expensive gold watch, his jaw clenching. He was calculating the delay. He was worried about the timeline for his fraudulent paperwork, not the man gasping for air on the floor. Then I heard the frantic rustle of silk. Chloe pushed her way through the growing crowd, her gorgeous white gown sweeping over the broken glass. She dropped to the floor beside me, oblivious to the dirt or the chaos, tears already streaming down her beautiful face. Dad, please look at me. What is happening?" She was sobbing, her hands desperately gripping my face. I forced myself to look at her, maintaining the illusion of weakness. I patted her hand softly, making my breathing sound labored. "I am sorry, baby girl. I am so sorry to ruin your day." Chloe shook her head violently, her veil slipping off her shoulders. Do not say that. Do not say that. The wedding does not matter. Nothing matters but you. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced through the heavy Atlanta heat. Paramedics rushed down the hallway with a stretcher and medical bags. They lifted me onto the gurney, attaching electrodes to my chest and strapping a blood pressure cuff to my arm. My vitals were actually elevated from the sheer adrenaline and suppressed rage pumping through my veins, which only sold the performance better. As they rolled me toward the exit, I kept my eyes fixed on Chloe, who was holding my hand, walking right beside the stretcher. But in my peripheral vision, I saw Preston lean over and whisper something into Spencer's ear. Spencer's face was a mask of cold, calculating fury. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. The heavy doors of the ambulance slammed shut, separating me from the Sterling family, but enclosing me with Chloe. She sat on the small jump seat, her hands covering her face, weeping silently. I hated myself for causing her this temporary terror, but it was the only way to save her from a lifetime of misery. The ride to the hospital was a blur of medical questions and flashing lights. When we arrived at the emergency room, the doctors immediately wheeled me into a private triage bay for observation. They ran EKGs, drew blood, and asked me a barrage of questions. I played the part of the exhausted recovering patient, complaining of lingering chest tightness, but insisting I felt a bit better now that I was resting. Chloe paced the small room still in her wedding dress, her phone clutched in her hand. She was fielding calls from confused relatives and furious vendors. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and my heart broke for her all over again. Dad, the doctors say your heart rhythm is stabilizing, she said, her voice shaking. They want to keep you overnight for observation, just to be safe. I told Spencer we have to postpone the reception indefinitely. I watched her face closely. How did he take the news? I asked, my voice intentionally raspy. Chloe hesitated, looking down at her phone screen. She bit her lower lip, a nervous habit she had carried since childhood. He is just stressed, Dad. He is dealing with his parents and the caterer. He said it is a logistical nightmare, but he understands. I knew she was lying to protect me. I knew Spencer was likely screaming at her over the phone, blaming her for the financial fallout of the delayed reception. Just then, the heavy curtain to my triage bay was pulled back forcefully. Preston Sterling stood in the doorway. He was still wearing his tailored groomsman suit, but his tie was loosened and his face was flushed red with anger. He stepped into the room, letting the curtain fall shut behind him, cutting us off from the busy emergency ward. Chloe stood up quickly. Preston, what are you doing here? Where is Spencer? Preston ignored her completely. He walked straight to the foot of my hospital bed, his eyes locked onto mine. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. The polite country club facade was entirely gone. Spencer is outside handling the disaster you created. Old man Preston said, his voice a low, threatening hiss. Do you have any idea how much money you just cost our family today? The venue is threatening to sue us for breach of contract. I maintained my weak, confused persona. I coughed lightly. I am sorry, Preston. It was a medical emergency. I could not control my heart. Preston leaned over the metal railing of the bed, invading my personal space. He lowered his voice even further, ensuring Chloe, who had stepped back in shock, could not hear his exact words over the ambient noise of the hospital monitors. Cut the crap, Tyrone, he muttered, his breath smelling of stale bourbon. I do not know if this is a real heart attack or just a convenient panic attack, because you realized you cannot afford to play in our league. But listen to me very carefully. You are going to sign whatever medical discharge papers they give you, and you are going to tell Chloe that the wedding is back on for next weekend. I stared at him, letting a genuine flicker of defiance show in my eyes. And if I do not, Preston smiled. It was the same cruel, arrogant smile I had seen on the hidden camera video. He pulled his smartphone from his jacket pocket and tapped the screen. He turned the device around and held it inches from my face. My blood ran completely cold. On the screen was a document. It was a termination letter drafted on the official letterhead of the charter school district where Chloe worked as a senior administrator. The document outlined a severe breach of professional conduct, alleging that Chloe had embezzled educational funds to pay for personal expenses. Attached to the digital file were several forged bank statements expertly doctored to look like Chloe had funneled school money into her personal wedding accounts. Preston watched my eyes scan the horrific document. He leaned closer. My father sits on the Educational Oversight Board for Fulton County, Tyrone. He has friends in very high places. We have already drafted this entire packet. If you permanently cancel this wedding, if you try to pull Chloe away from my brother and embarrass our family, I will hit send. This file goes directly to the superintendent, the local news outlets, and the district attorney. Chloe will not just lose her job. She will face federal embezzlement charges. She will never work in education again, and she will be publicly ruined. I felt a surge of violent rage so intense my monitor actually beeped in alarm. This was no longer just about Spencer dodging a bad business loan. The Sterling family was operating a full-scale, coordinated extortion ring. They were willing to destroy an innocent woman's life, career, and freedom just to force her into absorbing their financial failures. You would not dare, I whispered, my voice thick with suppressed fury. It is all fake. You forged those documents. Preston chuckled softly, tucking the phone back into his pocket. It does not matter if it is fake, old man. By the time the investigation clears her, the scandal will have already destroyed her reputation. The school board will fire her just to avoid the bad press. Now you have until Monday to convince your daughter to reschedule the ceremony and finalize the joint financial paperwork with Spencer. If you try to run or if you breathe a word of this to her, I destroy her life. He stood up straight, adjusted his jacket, and turned to Chloe, his face instantly morphing back into a mask of polite brotherly concern. Feel better, Tyrone, he said loudly. Chloe Spencer is waiting in the lobby. Call us if you need anything. Preston slipped out through the curtain, leaving a heavy, toxic silence in the small hospital room. Chloe rushed back to my side, her face pale. Dad, what did he say to you? He looked so angry. I looked at my beautiful, hard-working daughter. She had dedicated her life to helping underprivileged kids in Atlanta. She had built a spotless reputation through sheer determination and grace, and these ruthless men were holding a loaded digital gun to her head, ready to pull the trigger if she did not willingly step into their financial slaughterhouse. Nothing, baby girl, I said, forcing a reassuring smile. He was just stressed about the venue deposits. Everything is going to be fine. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the stiff hospital pillow. I had my answer. I could not simply tell Chloe to leave Spencer. If she walked away right now, the Sterlings would release the forged embezzlement documents and destroy her career, all while Spencer activated the fraudulent business loan to bankrupt her. They had trapped her in a perfectly constructed two-front war. But Preston had made one fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that a retired black transit worker from Chicago did not know how to fight a war in the dark. I waited until Chloe stepped out to use the restroom. The moment the curtain closed behind her, I threw off the thin hospital blanket and swung my legs over the side of the bed. I pulled my cell phone from my slacks, which were neatly folded on the chair beside me. I dialed a number I had not called in 3 years. David Hayes picked up on the second ring. David was not just an old friend from my days in Chicago. He was a ruthless, brilliant financial attorney who had moved to Atlanta to work as a senior partner in a major corporate litigation firm. He knew banking laws better than anyone in the state of Georgia. David, I need your help, I said, my voice low and urgent. It is a matter of life and death for Chloe. David's tone instantly shifted from friendly to strictly professional. Tell me exactly what is happening, Tyrone. I gave him the condensed version. I told him about the hidden camera video, the $250,000 toxic business loan Spencer had tricked Chloe into signing, and the $15,000 venue deposit Spencer had diverted. I finished by explaining Preston's visit and the forged embezzlement documents hanging over Chloe's career. David was silent for a long moment, processing the sheer magnitude of the crimes. Finally, he spoke. The business loan is standard predatory manipulation, he said, his voice calculating. But the $15,000 deposit, that is federal wire fraud. He forged a signature and moved certified funds across state lines to a shadow account. And what Preston just did with those fake school board documents, that is textbook felony extortion. I asked him what our next move was. I told him I needed to protect Chloe without triggering Preston's dead man switch. David sighed heavily into the phone. Tyrone, this is a highly volatile situation. The commercial loan documents Chloe signed this morning have a standard 48-hour processing delay. They do not activate until Monday morning at 9 a.m. If we do not stop them by then, the debt becomes legally binding, and unwinding, it will take years of brutal litigation. I gripped the edge of the hospital mattress. So we have until Monday morning to dismantle their entire family. We need irrefutable proof, David said firmly. A hidden camera video of them bragging is good, but any expensive defense lawyer will argue it was just drunk locker room talk. We need them to confess to the extortion and the wire fraud on a clear, undeniable recording, and we need to secure the physical copies of the forged loan documents before Spencer submits them to the bank. I stared at the blank wall of the triage room. My mind was moving with the cold, mechanical precision of a massive freight engine. The only way to get the physical documents and the confession was to bring the wolves directly into my own den. I told David I had a plan. I told him I was going to invite Spencer and Preston to my house tomorrow, under the pretense of surrender. I was going to offer them exactly what they wanted, and I was going to let their own insatiable greed build the cage that would lock them away forever. David agreed to stand by and prepare the federal injunctions. I hung up the phone just as Chloe walked back into the room. She looked exhausted, the heavy white fabric of her wedding gown pooling around her feet on the sterile hospital floor. I looked at my daughter, and the last shred of hesitation vanished from my soul. I was a father, and it was time to go to war. The cold, sterile air of the supply room faded the moment I pushed the heavy wooden door open. The thick, patterned carpet absorbed my footsteps, but my heart was beating like a jackhammer against my ribs. Out in the grand foyer, the string quartet was playing a soft, classical melody. 200 well-dressed guests were sitting in the grand chapel, waiting for a joyous celebration. They were waiting to watch two families unite in holy matrimony. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting right in the middle of a massive crime scene. I took a deep breath and adjusted the lapels of my tailored tuxedo. I let my shoulders slump just a fraction of an inch. I needed this performance to be entirely flawless. Working 30 hard years managing the transit lines of Chicago had taught me a whole lot about human behavior. I knew exactly what sheer panic looked like. I knew exactly what a man having a sudden medical emergency looked like. I took 3 slow, deliberate steps toward the groom's private suite. I made sure I was directly in the line of sight of the hired security guard standing by the archway and a passing waiter who was carrying a silver tray of expensive champagne flutes. Then I let it happen. I gasped loudly, making a harsh, ragged sound that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. I brought my right hand up and clutched the fabric of my suit jacket directly over my heart. I staggered forward, intentionally losing my balance. I allowed my knees to buckle just enough to send me crashing heavily against the oak-paneled wall. I slid down slowly, feeling the cool wood against my back. I forced my breath to come in short, panicked wheezes. The reaction from the hall was immediate and explosive. The young waiter dropped his tray. Crystal glasses shattered across the polished marble floor with a deafening crash, sending sparkling wine everywhere. The security guard yelled into his shoulder radio and sprinted toward me. "Sir, are you all right?" The guard fell to his knees beside me with his hands hovering over my shoulders, not knowing where to touch me. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced a grimace of intense, unbearable pain onto my face. I gripped his forearm tightly. I let my fingers tremble exactly the way they had when I suffered my real minor heart attack a few years back. "My chest," I whispered, making my voice sound incredibly strained and weak. "It is tight. I cannot breathe at all." Absolute chaos erupted in the elegant hallway. The heavy door to the groom's suite swung open violently. Spencer and Preston stepped out. Their arrogant country club smiles froze the second they took in the chaotic scene on the floor. The string quartet music in the distance abruptly stopped, leaving an eerie silence broken only by shouting. Heavy footsteps pounded down the corridor. "Call an ambulance, somebody call 911 right now." It was Valerie's voice ringing out loud and clear above the commotion. She was playing her part perfectly, acting like a terrified wedding coordinator. Through my half-closed eyelids, I watched Spencer. He looked deeply annoyed. He was not concerned. He was not frightened for the life of his future father-in-law. He was profoundly irritated by the inconvenience. He checked his expensive gold watch, and his jaw clenched hard. He was calculating the delay. He was worried about the strict timeline for his fraudulent paperwork. He did not care a single bit about the old man gasping for air on the floor. Then I heard the frantic rustling of heavy silk. Chloe pushed her way through the growing crowd of onlookers. Her gorgeous white wedding gown swept over the broken glass and spilled champagne. She dropped to the floor beside me, entirely oblivious to the dirt or the chaos around her. Hot tears were already streaming down her beautiful face, ruining her makeup. "Dad, please look at me. What is happening?" She was sobbing uncontrollably, and her hands desperately gripped my face. I forced myself to look at her, maintaining the painful illusion of weakness. I patted her hand softly and made my breathing sound dangerously labored. "I am sorry, baby girl. I am so sorry to ruin your special day." Chloe shook her head violently, and her delicate veil slipped off her shoulders onto the floor. "Do not say that. The wedding does not matter at all. Nothing matters but you getting better." Within minutes, the wail of approaching sirens pierced through the heavy Atlanta heat outside. Paramedics rushed down the hallway carrying a heavy stretcher and bright orange medical bags. They lifted my heavy frame onto the gurney. They attached cold, sticky electrodes to my chest and strapped a tight blood pressure cuff to my arm. My vitals were actually highly elevated from the sheer adrenaline and suppressed rage pumping through my veins. That physical reality only sold the performance much better. As they rolled me quickly toward the exit doors, I kept my eyes fixed on Chloe. She was holding my hand tightly and walking right beside the moving stretcher. But in my peripheral vision, I saw Preston lean over and whisper something dark into Spencer's ear. Spencer's face was a mask of cold, calculating fury. He was losing total control of his carefully crafted narrative, and he knew it. The heavy metal doors of the ambulance slammed shut with a loud bang. That sound separated me from the toxic Sterling family, but it enclosed me in a tight space with Chloe. She sat on the small jump seat with her hands covering her face, weeping silently into her palms. I hated myself for causing her this temporary terror. It broke my heart into pieces to see my only child cry on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. But I knew deep down it was the only way to save her from a lifetime of misery and total financial ruin. The bumpy ride to the hospital was a fast blur of medical questions and flashing red lights. When we finally arrived at the emergency room, the doctors immediately wheeled me into a private triage bay for close observation. They ran multiple tests, drew vials of blood, and asked me a relentless barrage of health questions. I played the part of the exhausted, recovering patient flawlessly. I complained of a lingering chest tightness, but insisted I felt a bit better now that I was resting in a bed. Chloe paced the small, sterile room, still wearing her massive wedding dress. Her cell phone was clutched tightly in her hand. She was fielding stressful calls from confused relatives and furious vendors who wanted their money. She looked so incredibly small and so vulnerable standing there. My heart broke for her all over again. "Dad, the doctors say your heart rhythm is finally stabilizing," she said, with her voice shaking with relief. "They want to keep you overnight for observation, just to be absolutely safe. I told Spencer we have to postpone the reception indefinitely." I watched her face closely, trying to read her emotions. "How did he take the news?" I asked, making my voice intentionally raspy and slow. Chloe hesitated and looked down at her glowing phone screen. She bit her lower lip. That was a nervous habit she had carried since she was a little girl in Chicago. "He is just really stressed, Dad. He is dealing with his angry parents and the caterer. He said it is a massive logistical nightmare, but he understands." I knew she was lying to protect my feelings. I knew Spencer was likely screaming at her over the phone and blaming her for the financial fallout of the delayed reception. Just then, the heavy curtain to my triage bay was pulled back forcefully. Preston Sterling stood in the doorway. He was still wearing his tailored groomsman suit, but his expensive tie was loosened and his face was flushed bright red with pure anger. He stepped into the room and let the thick curtain fall shut behind him. That action completely cut us off from the busy emergency ward outside. Chloe stood up quickly. "Preston, what are you doing here? Where is Spencer?" Preston ignored her completely, as if she were not even in the room. He walked straight to the foot of my hospital bed and locked his cold eyes onto mine. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. The polite Southern country club facade was entirely gone. "Spencer is outside handling the massive disaster you created," Old Man Preston said, with his voice dropping to a low, threatening hiss. "Do you have any idea how much money you just cost our family today? The venue is threatening to sue us for breach of contract, and the guests are demanding answers." I maintained my weak, confused persona perfectly. I coughed lightly into my hand. "I am sorry, Preston. It was a severe medical emergency. I could not control my heart." Preston leaned over the cold metal railing of the bed and aggressively invaded my personal space. He lowered his voice even further, ensuring Chloe, who had stepped back in shock, could not hear his exact words over the rhythmic ambient noise of the hospital monitors. "Cut the crap, Tyrone," he muttered. His breath smelled strongly of stale bourbon and mints. "I do not know if this is a real heart attack or just a convenient panic attack, because you realized you cannot afford to play in our wealthy league. But listen to me very carefully. You are going to sign whatever medical discharge papers they give you tonight, and you are going to tell Chloe that the wedding is back on for next weekend." I stared at him, letting a genuine flicker of fierce defiance show in my tired eyes. "And if I do not?" Preston smiled. It was the exact same cruel, arrogant smile I had seen on the hidden camera video back at the venue. He pulled his sleek smartphone from his jacket pocket and tapped the screen a few times. He turned the device around and held it just inches from my face. My blood ran completely cold in my veins. On the glowing screen was a highly detailed document. It was a formal termination letter drafted on the official letterhead of the specific charter school district where Chloe worked as a senior administrator. The document outlined a severe and shocking breach of professional conduct. It falsely alleged that Chloe had willfully embezzled educational funds to pay for her personal wedding expenses. Attached to the digital file were several forged bank statements. They were expertly doctored to look exactly like Chloe had funneled public school money directly into her personal checking accounts. Preston watched my eyes scan the horrific document with sick satisfaction. He leaned closer to my ear. My father sits on the Educational Oversight Board for Fulton County, Tyrone. He has very powerful friends in very high places. We have already drafted this entire packet to protect our family assets. If you permanently cancel this wedding, or if you try to pull Chloe away from my brother and embarrass our family name, I will hit send. This file goes directly to the school superintendent, to the local news outlets, and to the district attorney. Chloe will not just lose her career. She will face federal embezzlement charges. She will never work in education again, and she will be publicly and permanently ruined. I felt a massive surge of violent rage so intense my heart monitor actually beeped loudly in alarm. This was no longer just about Spencer dodging a bad business loan. The Sterling family was operating a full-scale coordinated extortion ring. They were entirely willing to destroy an innocent black woman's life, her career, and her freedom, just to force her into absorbing their own massive financial failures. "You would not dare," I whispered with my voice thick with suppressed fury and disbelief. "It is all fake. You forged those documents yourself." Preston chuckled softly and tucked the phone back into his tailored pocket. "It does not matter if it is fake, old man. By the time the long police investigation finally clears her, the public scandal will have already destroyed her spotless reputation. The school board will fire her immediately just to avoid the bad press. Now you have exactly until Monday morning to convince your daughter to reschedule the ceremony and finalize the joint financial paperwork with Spencer. If you try to run away or if you breathe a single word of this conversation to her, I will destroy her life without hesitation." He stood up straight and smoothly adjusted his jacket. He turned to Chloe and his face instantly morphed back into a fake mask of polite brotherly concern. "Feel better, Tyrone," he said loudly for her to hear. "Chloe Spencer is waiting anxiously in the lobby. Call us if you need absolutely anything." Preston slipped out through the curtain, leaving a heavy, toxic silence in the small hospital room. Chloe rushed back to my side with her face pale and worried. "Dad, what did he say to you? He looked so incredibly angry." I looked at my beautiful, hard-working daughter. She had dedicated her entire adult life to helping underprivileged kids in Atlanta. She had built a spotless professional reputation through sheer determination and grace. And these ruthless men were holding a loaded digital gun to her head, ready to pull the trigger if she did not willingly step into their financial slaughterhouse. "Nothing, baby girl," I said, forcing a warm, reassuring smile. "He was just stressed about the expensive venue deposits. Everything is going to be perfectly fine." I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the stiff hospital pillow. I had my answer. I could not simply tell Chloe to leave Spencer right now. If she walked away today, the Sterlings would mercilessly release the forged embezzlement documents and destroy her career, all while Spencer activated the fraudulent business loan to bankrupt her. They had trapped her in a perfectly constructed two-front war. But Preston had made one fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that a retired transit worker from the south side of Chicago did not know how to fight a brutal war in the dark. The heavy fabric of the privacy curtain settled back into place the second Preston stepped out of my triage bay. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my breathing shallow and my eyes fixed on the blank wall ahead of me. 30 years of handling crisis situations on the transit dispatch floor had taught me one absolute rule: never let the enemy see you sweat. Preston Sterling thought he had just delivered a fatal blow. He thought he had successfully terrified an uneducated old man into submission. I let him believe that. I let him walk down that sterile corridor, feeling like a victorious king. But the moment the rhythmic squeak of his expensive leather shoes faded into the background noise of the emergency room, my entire demeanor shifted. The fake weakness I had projected vanished completely. The cold, hard reality of the situation locked into my bones. Chloe returned a moment later, holding a small cup of water from the waiting room. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. I took the cup with a steady hand. I drank the water and gave her the most convincing smile I could muster. I told her the doctors wanted me to rest my eyes for a bit, and suggested she go find the cafeteria to get herself something to eat. She resisted at first, not wanting to leave my side, but I used my gentle but firm dad voice. I told her she had not eaten anything since dawn, and she needed her strength. Reluctantly, she kissed my forehead and slipped out of the room. As soon as she was out of earshot, I reached for my phone. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It belonged to David Hayes. David and I went way back to our 20s on the south side of Chicago. While I spent my life coordinating train schedules, David went to law school on a full scholarship. He was now a senior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms in Atlanta. He was a brilliant black man who had spent decades navigating boardrooms filled with people exactly like the Sterlings. If anyone knew how to dismantle a financial trap built by arrogant wealth, it was David. He picked up on the third ring. His voice was smooth and professional, but it warmed up the second he heard my name. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed his expertise immediately, and that Chloe was in grave danger. The warmth in his tone vanished, replaced instantly by the sharp, focused edge of a trial lawyer preparing for battle. I explained everything that had happened over the last few hours. I told him about the missing $15,000 catering deposit. I explained the hidden audio recording where Spencer admitted to using my life savings as petty cash while setting Chloe up to take the fall for a massive failing business debt. Finally, I detailed Preston coming into my hospital room and threatening to leak forged embezzlement documents to destroy my daughter's career if we dared to cancel the wedding. David remained completely silent on the other end of the line while I laid out the facts. When I finished, he let out a long, heavy sigh. "Tyrone," he said, his voice dead serious, "this is not just a messy family dispute. We are looking at multiple federal crimes. We need to secure the financial trail right now. I have a contact at the bank that handles the venue accounts. I am going to pull some strings and find out exactly where your money went. Give me 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes sitting alone in that hospital bed were pure torture. The monitor beeped rhythmically beside me, echoing the ticking clock in my head. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made to build a safe life for Chloe. I thought about my late wife and the promise I made to her on her deathbed, that I would always protect our little girl. The Sterlings had looked at my hard-earned money and seen nothing but a slush fund. They looked at my beautiful, educated daughter and saw nothing but a convenient scapegoat. The sheer disrespect of it all burned in my chest like hot coals. My phone vibrated, bringing me back to the present. It was David. The background noise on his end indicated he had moved to a secure room. "Tyrone," he said, his voice tight, with barely suppressed anger. "I found the money. And it is worse than we thought." I sat up straight, ignoring the pull of the medical wires taped to my chest. Tell me everything, I demanded. David broke it down with surgical precision. He explained that Spencer did not just cash the cashier's check I had given him. He had taken that check directly to a secondary financial institution. In order to redirect those funds without triggering an immediate fraud alert from the catering hall, Spencer needed authorization from the primary account holder. Since the wedding trust account was set up in Chloe's name, she was the only one who could legally authorize a wire transfer of that magnitude. So how did he do it? I asked, my grip tightening on the plastic bed rail. He forged her signature. Tyrone David replied flatly. He submitted a digital wire authorization form completely bypassing the venue. But that is not even the worst part. I tracked the routing number where the money was sent. It did not go to any business vendor. It was wired to a holding account registered in Nevada, an account that belongs to a shell company known for processing payments for unregulated offshore sports betting syndicates. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. An illegal gambling ring. Spencer had taken the $15,000 meant to feed our wedding guests and wired it across state lines to pay off a massive gambling debt. He had committed interstate wire fraud, and he had forged my daughter's signature to do it. If the authorities traced that money right now, Chloe would be the prime suspect in a federal investigation. Spencer had meticulously designed the transaction to completely shield himself while putting Chloe directly in the crosshairs of the FBI. My breathing grew heavy, but I kept my voice steady. What about the business loan? I asked. The one he bragged about on the hidden recording. David let out a harsh breath. I pulled the public filings on Spencer's logistics company. The business has been financially dead in the water for a year. They are drowning in debt and facing multiple lawsuits from unpaid suppliers. The $250,000 loan he tricked Chloe into co-signing this morning was a desperate lifeline. But here is the kicker, Tyrone. That specific type of commercial liability loan has a mandatory 48-hour processing window. Because they signed the paperwork on a Saturday morning, it will not officially activate and bind Chloe to the debt until Monday morning at exactly 9 a.m. I processed the timeline. It was Saturday afternoon. We had less than 48 hours before the trap snapped shut on my daughter's ankles. We have to cancel the loan, I said firmly. We call the bank, tell them it was signed under false pretenses, and shut it down. We cannot do that, Tyrone. David replied, his tone urgent and sharp. Think about the extortion threat Preston just made. If you actively block that loan or publicly cancel the wedding right now, Preston will hit send on those forged embezzlement documents. By the time we prove Chloe is innocent, the charter school board will have fired her. The local news will have dragged her spotless reputation through the mud. The Sterlings are banking on the fact that you will prioritize her immediate reputation over the financial debt. They have effectively checkmated you. If you fight the money, they destroy her career. If you protect her career, they steal her financial future. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. I realized the terrifying brilliance of the Sterling family's plan. They had constructed a flawless two-front war. Running away was not an option. Hiding was not an option. If we simply tried to walk away from the altar, my baby girl would be left bankrupt and publicly smeared as a thief. David continued, his voice lowering to a serious, conspiratorial whisper. Tyrone, we cannot just play defense. If we want to save Chloe and neutralize the extortion threat, we have to go on the offensive. We need irrefutable, undeniable proof of their crimes before Monday morning. A hidden audio recording of Spencer bragging to his brother in a dressing room is compelling, but a high-priced defense attorney will dismiss it as nervous wedding day banter. We need a direct confession. We need Spencer and Preston to clearly articulate the wire fraud and the extortion threat on a continuous verified recording. We need to catch them actively committing the crime. I stared at the sterile white tiles of the hospital floor. My mind shifted gears. I was no longer a frightened patient. I was a man preparing an ambush. The only way to get a confession of that magnitude was to make them feel completely victorious. I had to make them believe they had successfully broken me. They needed to feel so untouchable, so arrogant, and so utterly superior that they would willingly lay out their entire criminal enterprise right in front of me. I know exactly how to do it. I told David, my voice dropping to a low, steady rumble. I am going to invite them to my home. I am going to look them dead in the eye and offer them exactly what they want. I will tell them I am terrified of Preston's threats and that I want to buy my daughter's safety. I will offer to inject another $100,000 directly into Spencer's failing business just to keep the peace. David caught on immediately, his legal mind analyzing the strategy. You play the role of the defeated old man. You appeal to their greed. Exactly, I replied. Their arrogance is their greatest weakness. They look at me and they see an uneducated transit worker who does not understand complex finance. They think I am an easy mark. I am going to let them walk right into my living room, and I am going to let their own insatiable greed build the cage that will lock them away for a decade. David agreed to start drafting the necessary federal injunctions and preparing the framework to freeze the accounts the moment we had the evidence. We synchronized our timelines and I hung up the phone. I sat in the quiet hospital room, letting the gravity of the situation settle over me. I was about to invite predators into my sanctuary. I was about to sit across from the men who wanted to destroy my daughter's life and smile at them. But I felt no fear. I only felt a deep, unwavering resolve. I thought about the decades I spent making sure Chloe had a safe path in this world. I was not going to let a family of entitled criminals tear down everything she had built. I was going to secure her future, and I was going to make sure the sterling name became synonymous with federal prison. When Chloe finally returned to the room carrying a small paper cup of coffee, I was ready. The mask was securely back in place. I looked at her tired, beautiful face and promised myself that the tears she shed today would be the very last tears these men would ever cause her. The war had officially begun, and I was ready to bring the fight directly to their front door. The morning sunlight felt unusually harsh and blinding when I finally walked out of those sliding glass hospital doors. The emergency room doctors had just given me a completely clean bill of health. My heart was perfectly fine, beating with a steady, powerful rhythm. They told Chloe I had just suffered a severe panic attack brought on by the immense stress of the wedding. I let her believe that medical lie. It was easier that way. I hugged my daughter tight right there in the concrete parking lot, holding her as if she were a little girl again. I told her to go stay at her best friend's house for the entire weekend. I told her I needed absolute quiet to rest my old bones, and that she deeply needed space to clear her head after the canceled reception. She did not want to leave my side, but she was emotionally and physically exhausted. Her beautiful spirit was bruised, and she needed a safe haven away from the Sterling family drama. Once I watched her drive away in her compact sedan, I climbed into my own car and gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned pale. The fake hospital patient routine was officially over. It was time to switch roles again. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed Spencer. He answered on the fourth ring. His tone was clipped and dripping with the kind of condescension you usually reserve for a telemarketer or a subordinate. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask if my heart condition had stabilized. He simply demanded to know what I wanted. I closed my eyes and forcefully swallowed every single ounce of pride I had built up over 6 decades as a hardworking black man in America. I forced my voice to tremble. I made myself sound small, broken, and utterly terrified of his family's influence. I told him I was calling to sincerely apologize. I apologized for the medical episode. I apologized for ruining the meticulously planned schedule. I told him Preston had visited me in the hospital and opened my eyes to the absolute gravity of the situation. I made sure to sound exactly like a frightened old man who suddenly realized he had stepped way out of his social and financial league. I begged him to come to my house that afternoon. I told him I wanted to make things right between our families before the weekend was over. Spencer let out a loud, arrogant sigh into the receiver. He acted like I was begging him for a massive, unearned favor. He told me his time was incredibly valuable and that he and Preston were heavily busy dealing with the financial fallout from the venue. That is exactly when I dropped the heavy bait. I kept my voice shaky and profoundly submissive. I told him I felt terrible about his recent business struggles and the mounting pressure he was under. I said I had been thinking extensively about my daughter's future, and I wanted to ensure her absolute financial security moving forward. I spun a massive lie and told him I had a secondary high-yield retirement portfolio I had never touched. I offered to liquidate another $100,000 in cash and invest it directly into his struggling logistics company. I called it a humble peace offering. I called it a father's way of securing his daughter's rightful place in his prestigious family. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could practically hear the gears turning rapidly in his greedy, calculating mind. $100,000 in clean, untraceable cash was a massive lifeline his drowning business desperately needed. But I added one single reasonable condition to the offer. I told him I was an old-school man who needed to see things clearly on paper before moving that kind of capital. I said if I was going to drop $100,000 into his corporate accounts, I needed to review the exact commercial loan documents Chloe had signed that morning. I framed it as wanting to understand the debt structure so we could consolidate everything and allow them to start their marriage with a completely clean slate. I begged him to bring the physical paperwork to my living room so we could handle the transaction privately like gentlemen. Greed is a powerful, blinding drug. It makes otherwise cautious men reckless and arrogant men foolish. Spencer did not suspect a single thing. He saw a broken blue-collar worker waving a massive check, trying to buy his way out of trouble. He saw an easy mark completely surrendering to his brother's aggressive extortion threat. He agreed immediately. He said he and Preston would drive over to my house at 4 o'clock sharp with the legal files. He even had the nerve to tell me to have some top-shelf bourbon ready for the emptied when they arrived. I thanked him profusely, pouring on the fake gratitude thick and heavy. When I ended the call, I let out a long breath I did not realize I had been holding. The wolves had eagerly taken the bait. Now I just needed to build an inescapable cage. I drove straight from the hospital to a high-end, specialized electronics store in downtown Atlanta. I did not care about the hefty price tags. I needed the absolute best surveillance equipment civilians could legally purchase. I bought 3 ultra-high-definition hidden cameras. They were brilliant pieces of modern technology. One was built directly into the face of a digital alarm clock. Another was hidden perfectly inside a functional dual-port USB wall charger. The third was a tiny pinhole lens seamlessly integrated into a fake potted fern. I also bought a brand new high-capacity encrypted external hard drive and a premium lapel microphone just in case the ambient audio was not clear enough. When I got back to my quiet suburban house, I immediately went to work. I might have spent my life dispatching heavy trains on the south side of Chicago, but I am not ignorant when it comes to technology. Plus, I had David on speed dial walking me through the complex software configurations. I placed the digital clock on the mantel right above the brick fireplace, giving it a sweeping, panoramic view of the entire living room. I plugged the USB charger into the wall outlet, directly facing the custom leather sofa, where I knew Spencer and Preston would inevitably sit. I placed the potted fern on the glass coffee table, ensuring it had a crystal-clear angle on their faces and whatever physical documents they placed down between us. Next came the laptop. David had sent me a secure encrypted link to a professional-grade screen logger program used by private investigators. I installed it quickly and verified the background processes. This software would silently record every single keystroke, every mouse movement, and every browser window opened on my computer, while running completely invisible to the user. If Spencer brought digital files on a flash drive, or if we needed to pull up banking portals to verify the transfer, the screen logger would capture the exact routing numbers and the digital signatures without him ever knowing he was being monitored. I set up the audio feeds, testing the sound quality by walking around the room and speaking in a low conversational tone. The hidden microphones picked up every syllable perfectly without any static or distortion. The setup was absolutely flawless. The entire living room was now a high-tech interrogation chamber, brilliantly disguised as a cozy southern home. With the trap fully armed and tested, I sat down in my worn leather recliner and stared at the empty sofa opposite me. The late afternoon sun was casting long, golden shadows across the polished hardwood floors. The house was painfully quiet. This was the exact same living room where Chloe used to do her high school homework, sitting cross-legged on the rug. This was the room where we watched movies on Friday nights, eating popcorn and laughing until our sides hurt. This was the space where I proudly took her college graduation photos. It was a sanctuary built on honest sweat, deep love, and unwavering faith. The idea that two entitled, arrogant criminals were about to walk through my front door and poison this sacred space filled me with a quiet, simmering rage, but I pushed the anger down deep into the pit of my stomach, where it could not interfere with my judgment. Anger makes you sloppy. Anger makes you impulsive. I needed to be entirely cold. I needed to be completely hollow. I had to let them insult my intelligence. I had to let them belittle my home, my life achievements, and my daughter. I had to smile politely while they held a metaphorical knife to my family's throat, because that was the only way they would feel comfortable enough to brag about their federal crimes. I looked up at the digital clock on the mantel. The hidden camera lens was completely invisible to the naked eye. It was 3:45 in the afternoon. They would be arriving any minute now. I thought about the $15,000 Spencer had shamelessly stolen that morning. I thought about the illegal offshore gambling syndicate he had wired my hard-earned retirement money to. I thought about the massive fake commercial loan hovering dangerously over Chloe's financial future. And I thought about the forged school board documents Preston had violently shoved in my face at the hospital. They truly believed they had engineered the absolute perfect crime. They believed their vast generational wealth, their race, and their elevated social status made them completely immune to any real consequences. They were absolutely convinced that an older black man from the transit yards would just bow his head and take a brutal beating to protect his child's reputation. They did not understand that a father's profound love is not about submission. It is about doing whatever it takes to permanently neutralize the threat. I was not going to negotiate with these terrorists. I was going to let them hang themselves with their own arrogant words. The sudden loud crunch of heavy tires rolling onto my gravel driveway broke the heavy silence of the house. A moment later, I heard the distinct, aggressive slam of luxury car doors closing. Heavy, confident footsteps approached my front porch. My heart rate stayed perfectly even. I stood up slowly, smoothed out the wrinkles in my slacks, and walked toward the front door. The doorbell rang with a sharp, demanding sound that echoed through the quiet hallways. I took one final deep breath. I let my shoulders drop forward again, recreating the posture of a defeated man. I arranged my facial features into an expression of deep anxiety and eager submission. The stage was perfectly set. The high-definition cameras were rolling silently. The financial bait was dangling right in front of their greedy faces. All I had to do now was open the heavy front door and invite the monsters inside my home. I turned the solid brass knob and pulled the heavy front door open. The thick, humid air of the Georgia afternoon rolled into my foyer, and right behind it came the Sterling family. I had only been expecting Spencer and his brother Preston, but they decided to bring their parents along for the ride. Richard and Patricia Sterling stood on my welcome mat, looking like they had just stepped out of an upscale country club catalog. Richard wore a crisp pastel polo shirt, tucked into expensive linen trousers, while Patricia clutched a designer handbag tightly against her chest. She held it like a protective shield, as if my quiet, manicured suburban neighborhood was somehow crawling with invisible dangers. I swallowed my disgust and plastered a nervous, welcoming smile across my face. I stepped aside and gestured for them to come in. I played the part of the intimidated old man perfectly. I hunched my shoulders slightly and kept my gaze lowered, greeting them with excessive politeness. They walked past me without a single word of thanks. They stepped into my home with an incredible sense of entitlement, looking around my living room with thinly veiled disdain. Patricia immediately started making her passive-aggressive comments. She ran a manicured finger over the back of my worn leather recliner and let out a soft, condescending sigh. She told me my home was surprisingly quaint for someone who spent so many years working in the dirty train yards of Chicago. She said it must be a real adjustment living in a simple space after spending so much money on the wedding. Richard chuckled at her comment, adjusting his expensive watch. He added that people from my particular background usually struggled with financial literacy, so it was a good thing their family was stepping in to take the reins. Every word out of their mouths was a deliberate, calculated insult designed to remind me of my place. I felt a familiar hot anger flaring up in my chest, but I forced it down into the darkest corner of my mind. I let them feel vastly superior. I guided them to the custom leather sofa, positioning them perfectly in front of the wall outlet, where my high-definition hidden camera was seamlessly disguised as a dual-port USB charger. I offered them cold drinks, which they rudely declined, and then I took my seat in the recliner across from them. I opened my laptop and rested it on my knees. The screen logger program was running silently in the background, capturing every single digital move I made. Spencer sat between his parents, looking incredibly smug. He did not look like a man whose fraudulent business was crumbling to the ground. He looked like a predator who had successfully cornered an exhausted animal. Preston stood behind the sofa, leaning casually against the wall with his arms crossed over his chest, playing the role of the silent enforcer. I looked directly at Spencer and let my hands tremble visibly as they rested on my laptop keyboard. I told him I was incredibly sorry for the scene I caused at the chapel. I explained that my old heart just could not handle the immense stress of the missing venue deposit and the sudden wedding changes. I laid the desperation on thick. I told him I wanted to make everything right immediately. I said my daughter meant the absolute world to me, and I could not bear the thought of her starting her marriage with financial friction. I reiterated the lie I had spun on the phone. I told them I was prepared to liquidate a secret retirement portfolio and transfer $100,000 directly into his corporate business account right now. The physical shift in the room was instant. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Patricia's cold eyes suddenly lit up with profound greed. Spencer let out a slow, relaxed breath and gave me a patronizing smile. He told me I was finally making a smart decision. He said families needed to support each other, and that my financial contribution would ensure Chloe remained comfortable in the lifestyle the Sterlings had graciously provided for her. I nodded eagerly, looking down at my computer screen. I told him the money was ready to be wired, but I needed peace of mind. I said I was just a retired transit worker, and I did not understand high-level corporate finance. I asked him to pull out the exact loan documents Chloe had signed that morning. I begged him to explain the $250,000 debt to me in simple terms, so I could feel absolutely certain my $100,000 was actually going to fix the problem. Spencer chuckled, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a slow child. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. He tossed it carelessly onto the glass coffee table right in the direct line of sight of the pinhole camera hidden inside my potted fern. The lens captured the crisp white pages, the bank logos, and the forged digital signatures with absolute perfect clarity. Spencer leaned back on the sofa, crossing his legs. He spoke slowly and loudly, deliberately, dumbing down his vocabulary. He told me that business involves taking aggressive risks, and sometimes those risks require sudden capital. He explained that his logistics company was facing a temporary cash flow issue due to some unpaid supplier invoices. He needed a massive commercial liability loan to stay afloat, but his personal credit was completely maxed out. That was where my beautiful, trusting daughter came into his plan. He proudly explained how he brought the digital smart pad to Chloe while she was getting her hair done in the bridal suite. He bragged to his parents and his brother about how incredibly easy it was to deceive her. He told me he simply covered the top half of the screen with a wedding vendor contract and told Chloe she was signing a standard insurance waiver for the reception venue. He laughed, a dark, arrogant sound that echoed in my living room. He admitted right there on camera that Chloe had absolutely no idea she was legally binding herself as the primary guarantor for $250,000 in toxic corporate debt. He thought his deception was a mark of sheer genius. He thought he was proving his business dominance to his father. I stared at him, letting my mouth hang open slightly in fake confusion. I asked him why he had to do it behind her back. I asked him why he did not just ask my daughter for help honestly. Patricia scoffed, rolling her eyes. She told me Chloe was far too emotional and naive to understand corporate survival. She said women from working-class families always panicked when confronted with real financial stakes, so Spencer did the responsible thing by handling the legalities quietly. She actually praised her son for tricking my child into a massive financial slaughterhouse. I took a slow breath, keeping my hands firmly on my laptop. The audio recording was picking up every single horrific admission. I had them exactly where I wanted them, but I needed to close the net completely. I brought up the missing venue money. I told Spencer I was still incredibly confused about why the catering hall manager called me screaming about the final deposit. I asked him how a certified bank check for $15,000 could just vanish into thin air. Preston let out a short, mocking laugh from his spot against the wall. Spencer waved his hand dismissively, acting completely unbothered by the question. He looked at me with an expression of total invincibility. He explicitly stated that he needed fast, liquid cash to settle a private debt in Nevada before the weekend was over. He told me he took the cashier's check I gave him, drove to a secondary branch, and initiated an electronic wire transfer. I pushed him a little further, acting completely lost. I asked him how he could possibly wire funds out of a wedding trust account that was strictly in Chloe's name. Spencer smiled a wide, chilling smile. He proudly admitted that he bypassed the banking security protocols by logging into Chloe's online portal, using her saved passwords on his phone. He explicitly confessed to forging her digital authorization signature to push the wire transfer across state lines into a shadow account. He boasted about how fast the money moved and how clueless the venue manager was. He sat in my home, drank my air, and casually confessed to federal wire fraud, identity theft, and interstate financial crimes, thinking I was too uneducated to understand the massive legal implications of his words. I looked down at my keyboard. My heart was a steady block of ice. I had the wire fraud confession, I had the fraudulent loan admission. Now I needed to capture the final and most dangerous piece of their criminal puzzle. I let my hands start shaking again. I looked up at the entire family projecting pure desperation. I told them I was terrified. I said if Chloe found out about the forged loans and the stolen venue money, she would be absolutely devastated. I told them my daughter was fiercely independent, and if she felt betrayed, she would definitely cancel the rescheduled wedding and walk away from the relationship completely. I pleaded with them, asking what would happen to her if she refused to play along with their grand plan. The smug atmosphere in the room instantly vanished. The polite Southern masks completely fell away, revealing the ruthless predators hiding underneath. Richard Sterling leaned forward,